Okay, we are live with Alexander Mercouris in London, and we are joined today, first time on the Duran. Very happy to have with us Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. Dr. Papadopoulos, Marcus, how are you doing today? Welcome to the Duran. It is a pleasure to have you with us on this live stream. And before we get started, tell us about your book, and I also have a link to your X account as well in the description box down below where people can follow you.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say how delighted I am to be joining both of you today and how very much I'm looking forward to our discussion. Regarding my two books, the first one, Arise Russia, The Return of Russia to World Politics, was published in January of 2021. And essentially, it is an appraisal of contemporary Russian foreign policy, though I do provide history to the Russian Empire, or a brief history to the Russian Empire, to the Soviet Union, making the argument that the Soviet Union did not collapse. Rather, the Soviet Union was dissolved, and dissolved by three treacherous Soviet politicians: Boris Yeltsin of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, and of course Kravchuk in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, and Shushkevich in the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. Secondly, my more recent book, Whitehall in Stalin's Russia, British Assessments of the Red Army, 1934 to 1945, was published in November of 2023. And this book focuses on 2 points. Firstly, how British assessments of the prowess of the Soviet armed forces from 1934 to 1945 played a major role in British strategic planning in the aforementioned period, and also how ingrained Russophobia in Whitehall, principally amongst the military officers and intelligence officers, resulted in not just underestimating Soviet military potential, but also it played a role, and I emphasize a role, not the role, a role in undermining the Anglo-Soviet Treaty of May of 1942 and the Grand Alliance. So essentially, I argue that one of the main reasons as to why the Grand Alliance fell apart after the end of the Second World War was on account of Russophobia in Whitehall. And I should also say that it was myself who introduced the word Russophobia to audiences in the West at the beginning of 2014, following the Western orchestrated coup against the then president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych. And I'm very happy now to see so many people who are aware of Russophobia. Also in Whitehall in Stalin's Russia, I provide a very long history of Russophobia in Britain from the 1500s all the way up to 1945.
Okay, well, we'll be talking about some of these topics, no doubt today, because certainly we will discuss Britain too.
And I have a link to those books in the description box down below, and I will add them as a pinned comment as well to Dr. Papadopoulos' Amazon page when the live stream is over. So definitely check out the works from Dr. Papadopoulos. So before we get started, a quick hello to everyone that is watching us on Odyssey, on Rockfin, on Locals, the Duran.locals.com, also on Rumble, and everybody on YouTube, and a big shout out to our moderators on YouTube as well, Zariel and Peter. Good to have you with us moderating the YouTube chat. So, Alexander, Marcus, let's talk about what is happening in Russia.
Indeed, let us do so. Now, I was in Russia about 2 weeks ago, though only for a very short time, in St. Petersburg to be precise, and I was meeting with I was attending a conference, a lawyers' conference, not military people at all, can I just say. They were all civilians. Many of them had had contacts with the West. Some of them had been involved in law firms that had Russian law firms that had close contacts with the West. Some of them had worked in Western law firms. Some of them had contacts with the Council of Europe, the organization that heads that of which the European Court of Human Rights is a part. So you could argue a community of Russian civilian people who have had the strongest possible interactions with the West. And as I've said to various people, if you wanted to find liberal views or pro-Western views, you would perhaps have expected to find them within this community. I didn't. Of course, I wasn't able to speak to everybody at that forum, but I found nothing of that sort at all. What I found instead, and this takes us back to the things that Dr. Papadopoulos has just been talking about, is a very strong sense of continuity between the conflict in Ukraine today and earlier conflicts which Russia has been involved in. First and foremost, obviously, the Second World War. Secondly, obviously, conflicts that have existed between the West and Russia, and especially between Russia and Britain, which is, of course, Dr. Papadopoulos and mine adopted country. So I would like to no better person to discuss all of these things than with Marcus. And Marcus, let's first of all begin. I mean, do you agree with me that the Russians do see continuities between the current conflict in Ukraine and the previous conflicts of the Second World War and other periods in their history? Certainly, my impression was that they seemed to think that this was just another case of the West ganging up against them.
Well, I should first of all say that Anglo-Russian relations has long intrigued me, indeed fascinated me. From the very time that diplomatic relations were established between Britain and Russia in the 1500s to the present day, we see distinct patterns, this very distinct patterns, not just in the last 80 years and the last 100 years, but over many centuries. So essentially, Britain and Russia, whilst they have been on the same side as each other, for example, in the First World War and in the Second World War, they have never trusted each other. Indeed, they have never liked each other. And of course, I am talking about the British establishment and the Russian, Soviet, modern day Russian establishment. So what we see happening today regarding relations between London and Moscow is anything but unprecedented. Let me cite an example. The Crimean War, which ran from 1853 to 1856. For the first year of that war, when Britain and Russia were fighting each other directly, not by proxy, directly, there were diplomatic relations between London and Moscow. That is something most people are not aware of. If we fast forward to the present day, yes, there is a very compelling argument to be made that how Britain sees Russia, indeed how Russia sees Britain, is no different to how both sides saw each other during the First World War and the Second World War. Their mindsets are very different, and many of their values are very different. So no one should be surprised at what we are seeing today. If we go back to the Crimean War, the language which was being used in the House of Commons about the Russian Empire at that time is not so different to the language which is being used today by British officials regarding Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine. So clearly there is a very distinct pattern at play, and people need to understand that during the Second World War, it was a business relationship. It was a business partnership. And as my book, Whitehall in Stalin's Russia, demonstrates by using primary source evidence, i.e. British government files, Both sides behind the scenes were at each other's throats, not so much British diplomats, but the military officers and the intelligence officers. The language, for example, that military observers were using about the Russians when they were fighting together against Nazi Germany is quite remarkable. But when you consider the reality that both sides over centuries have despised each other, it is no surprise whatsoever.
Is that why? Is that consistent with the kind of commentary that you see today in so much of the British media describing the performance of the Russian military in Ukraine? I mean, it is consistently denigrating, and I mean, it's awful. And I mean, I've seen some commentators, for example, one in the Daily Telegraph, who I'm not going to name, by the way, he refers regularly to the Russian army as the Russian horde. Words, a language which would not be acceptable, used about any other army in any other place. It wouldn't be used, for example, to describe any army in the Middle East.
This is something which reflects what has happened to Britain especially in the last 20 years. I am of English, German, and Greek ancestry, and I'm very proud of my English ancestry. However, Britain, in my opinion, no longer exists. There is nothing remotely British about this island today, and that is another story. So what I am driving at is this. British media today lacks journalists who have even the most fundamental knowledge and awareness about Russian history, about Russian culture, and about the Russian mindset. If you go to the archives during the years of 1941 to 1945, and if you read the articles in the columns published, for example, in the Times, you will see the difference. Not that I'm saying that journalists in Britain at that time were truly independent, because they weren't, but their written English was beautiful. Their knowledge of Russia was vastly superior to the knowledge, and I use the word knowledge in a very loose way, of today's journalists in Britain. Suffice to say, mainstream journalists in Britain today and the columnists in Britain today are not true journalists. They're not true columnists, and they are anything but experts on Russia. They are simply propagandists. They are simply useful idiots. And it is dreadful to read what they are writing about the war in Ukraine. They are projecting Russia, which is a military and nuclear superpower, as a backward, primitive force. What they are not telling their readers, if we assume they have that knowledge in the first place, that Russia, if need be, can call up 23 million soldiers, that Russia has all in all, in service and in storage, over 26,000 tanks. The Russian military industrial complex, ever since 1947, has been tasked with the responsibility of sustaining the Russian armed forces in a war with America. So the Russians in Ukraine can lose a very large amount of hardware, let's say in a month. Russian armaments factories, which are the size of towns in Britain, for example, can replenish the losses on the front line in Ukraine in a very short period of time. My estimation is that the Russian High Command is using between 12 and 15% of the overall capacity of the Russian armed forces for war in Ukraine, which is a very small percentage. And yet, look what the Russian armed forces have achieved so far. Over 20% of the lands which comprise Ukraine have been captured. Vast losses have been inflicted on the Ukrainian armed forces in terms of soldiers and hardware, and also the Russian military industrial complex and the Russian armed forces as a whole have drained the stockpiles of major NATO countries, including America. Indeed, only recently, Trump acknowledged that in certain departments, the American military is now lacking weapons because of the amount of American weapons which were sent to the Ukrainian government and which have either been destroyed or captured by the Russians.
Indeed, and we've had a strategic defence review in Britain, which describes the condition of our armed forces and says exactly the same thing. It talks about, in particular, the condition of the army. It talks about our shortage of tanks, the fact that we have no self-propelled howitzers left, the fact that we have severe ammunition shortages. There are problems at every conceivable level, certainly of our ground forces. And it's quite explicit that this is connected to the fact that we have been sending our weapons in vast quantities to Ukraine. But if I can just go back to that commentator who, as I said, used that particular word to describe the Russian military today, what I think I should mention about him is that, like a lot of the military commentators, the Russian-related commentators in the Telegraph, where he writes, he is a former British Army officer. And he seems to me to have exactly the same kind of outlook and perspective on Russia that you spoke about British Army officers and intelligence officers of the 1940s during the Second World War having about Russia then.
Russophobia is a historic phenomenon in Whitehall and at Westminster. And no doubt whatsoever, and it's being demonstrated today, that Russophobia is alive and well in Britain. But I should point out that behind the scenes, there are no doubt observers, officials in Whitehall who have a very different opinion to the British policy towards Russia. My book, What Stalin in Whitehall's Russia, demonstrated, highlighted a group of diplomats in the Northern Department at the time. The Northern Department focused on Eastern Europe, which included the Soviet Union, who wanted an alliance between Britain and the Soviet Union from the mid-1930s onwards to try and deter Nazi Germany from expansionism. And I believe that in 30 or so years, when the archives are opened up, we will see, assuming, of course, all three of us are still alive and kicking, we will see these files demonstrate that there were conflicting arguments in the Foreign Office regarding the policy towards Russia. So what we see on television, what we read in the newspapers, what we hear on the radio is one thing, but there is a lot going on behind the scenes. It is the same reason as to why I say there will not be a war between America and Russia, and there will not be a war between Britain and Russia, because what we see happening on the surface is very different to what we see happening behind the scenes. So if we take Britain and Russia, despite the immense animosity being expressed by both sides publicly, they're still trading with each other. Britain is still purchasing Russian natural resources. And as I said, the first year of the Crimean War, both sides had diplomatic relations with each other. And we should also be thankful for this. There are people in Britain and in Russia, from the political sector, from the military sector, from the intelligence sector, people whose names you will never know, people who you will never see on television, and their counterparts in Russia. Both sides talk to each other every single day of the week. They are tasked with ensuring that war does not break out between themselves. So whatever our criticisms are of, for example, British foreign policy towards Russia, we should remember that there are people in Britain and in America who are heroes, who have been talking to each other, especially since the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And these channels of communication are fascinating. They talk to each other in various ways, and they meet in various places. So yes, things are very dangerous, and there is always the potential for an accidental war between the West and Russia. But aside from an accidental war, there will not be a war between both sides, because a war between both sides, a conventional war between both sides, would rapidly escalate into a nuclear war. That is why those channels of communication exist between America and Russia. And that is why those channels of communication exist between Britain and Russia. And once again, I am not talking about people in the House of Commons. I'm not talking about columnists in the Telegraph or in the Times or their counterparts in Russia. No, these people you will not know.
We do have a certain tradition. I mean, you say that we've been hostile and have disliked the Russians in Britain since the 15th century. And I think overall that is certainly true. But there has always been a tradition also in Britain of taking great interest and even liking for Russian things. I mean, many people don't know the fact, but the first allusion to Russia was made by none other than Shakespeare, and it was a positive one. He refers to Russia in one of his plays, The Winter's Tale, and his heroine in that play is actually Russian. Again, it's a fact which hardly anybody realizes. And as I said, she is a very, very sympathetic person. And we've had other periods of time in British history where we've had intellectuals in particular taking an interest in Russia. There was the so-called Russian phase just before and during the First World War, when there was a lot big interest in Russian literature, for example. So there is that tradition, but it never seems to have any effect on policy. It doesn't seem to work through to the politicians. And why is that?
Oh, it certainly is the case that from the 1500s onwards, when diplomatic relations were established between Britain and Russia, amongst some officials, and in particular amongst members of the British public, there was an interest in Russian culture. And for example, during the Great War, during the First World War, one British diplomat wrote in a minute, a file which I came across at the National Archives in Kew. He lamented how he wished the how there would be more cultural interest in Britain vis-a-vis Russia, because he said if there was more cultural awareness and interest of Russia in Britain, this would help political relations between the two countries. And he was absolutely correct. The problem is quite straightforward. Britain and Russia, be it the British Empire, the Russian Empire, British Empire, then the Soviet Union, modern day Britain and modern day Russian Federation, are rivals. So even when there was interest in Russian culture in Britain, that was always surpassed by the fact that both countries were bitter rivals for each other, especially from 1870 onwards, when the Russian Empire expanded all the way through Central Asia to the border with British India. It was really from that period onwards, from 1870 onwards, when the Russian Empire was on the border with British India, when Russophobia took on a whole new dimension in Britain. So whilst it is sad that two European countries, two Christian countries, bitterly dislike each other, we have to acknowledge that both are rivals with one another. And it should also be known that whilst there is clear animosity, historic animosity in Britain towards Russia, there is also historic animosity in Russia towards Britain. I am, again, talking at a political level. I'm not talking about the average person in Britain and the average person in Russia, but that it's simply an irrefutable fact that Britain and Russia have always been rivals with each other. Indeed, they have sometimes been enemies, and they always will be. The most important thing for me is that the channels of communication which exist behind the scenes between Britain and Russia remain intact. If once the war in Ukraine ends, and it will end sooner rather than later, which I have said from day one will result in Russia either capturing all or most of Ukraine, at some point after that, tension between London and Moscow will start to decline. And I sincerely hope that relations can somewhat improve, because they did improve after the Crimean War, and they did improve at certain stages during the Cold War. But the reality is that Britain and Russia have never liked each other, and they never will like one another.
I have to say, when I was in Russia, and when I had been to Russia before, my major impression there is not so much of dislike of Britain as complete bafflement. I mean, they just don't understand why we have this attitude towards them. I mean, I can accept that, you know, during the time of the Second World War and before, when Britain was a great power, it was taken very seriously in Russia and was seen as a major adversary and rival. And I think I'm right in saying that Stalin himself, for example, was always deeply suspicious of the British, even though he did develop a relationship with Churchill. But today, the Russians do not think of us as a great power in that sense. And they do ask, and I've had this question put to me many times, why exactly therefore have you got this big issue with us? It's not as if we're really coming for you. I mean, this isn't about you at all. But why do you constantly pick battles with us? And I've heard this from many people at many different levels of Russian society, for, you know, people that you meet in cafes and other places, right up to people who are much closer, if you like, to the political system.
Stalin had a pathological distrust and dislike of the British ruling elite, not the British people, the British ruling elite. Stalin's premise when dealing with the British, even during the Second World War, was when the British say one thing, think the other. Because if they say black, they actually mean white. Now, turning to the present day, on the face of it, Britain does not come across as having a tremendous amount of influence and power in the world. But the reality, and it's a reality that the Russians behind the scenes know, is that Britain has an enormous amount of influence and power in the world. So I have noticed in recent years that Kremlin officials are referring to the Anglo-Saxon world, to the Anglo-Saxon powers. Now, they don't mean that in a derogatory way, because as I said earlier, I am part of English ancestry, and I'm very proud to be part Anglo-Saxon. But what the Russians are driving at, and I have mentioned this for nearly 20 years now on television and in my books, that when we talk about the Anglo-Saxon world, we are talking about one world. We are talking about Britain, America, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, because the political ruling elites in America, in Canada, in Australia, and New Zealand are overwhelmingly of Anglo-Saxon heritage or Anglo-Celtic heritage. So, for example, Scots-Irish heritage. And of course, 80% of the Australian population and a similar percentage of the New Zealand population is of Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-Celtic ancestry. So the Anglo-Saxon world, which I believe Britain and America are at the heart of, for example, the city of Westminster, has immense power and influence in the world. So yes, some Russians will say, well, look at the size of the British armed forces. Yes, they are right, but I would argue that there is a very sinister, very malevolent transition going on in Britain and the rest of the Anglo-Saxon world and the rest of the Western world at present. But that is another subject. That's another subject for another time. But the reality is that the heart of the global banking system, the heart of the global financial system is in Britain. It is in London. It is in the city of Westminster. So why, whilst, as I said, on the face of it, Britain doesn't appear to have much power, the British ruling elite most certainly do. And I just want to make it clear, I'm not talking about the likes of Starmer or Johnson or Sunak. These are puppets. These are useful idiots. I'm talking about the heart of the British ruling elite. And the heart of the British ruling elite is the monarchy followed by the aristocracy, followed by the banking elites, the financial elites, the military chiefs, and the intelligence chiefs. So when I say on television, the British establishment, the British ruling elite, I'm not talking about the useful idiots such as Starmer or David Lammy. I mean, Starmer and Lammy's knowledge of international affairs is almost exclusively, let me repeat that, is exclusively confined to Wikipedia. They just do what they're told. The person running the Foreign Office is not David Lammy. Indeed, it wasn't run by his predecessors. It is the permanent undersecretary of the Foreign Office. And the permanent undersecretaries are drawn from the heart of the British ruling elite, such as the aristocracy. So Britain and the whole of the Anglo-Saxon world has immense power. But there are very serious challenges now to the ruling power in the Anglo-Saxon world, because of course we have Trump in the White House. And I'm not going to unsay one word of criticism I have made about Trump over the years, but I am glad he won the election because he is anti-woke. He is anti-mass immigration. He defends the spiritual and cultural values of the Western nations, be it Americans, be it Greeks, be it Britons, etc. He is talking to the Iranian government. He is talking to the Russian government. Something is better than nothing. The problem facing Trump and his administration is that they are not fully in control of America. The deep state remains entrenched in power. So the war against the deep state in America will go on for many, many years. So Trump and his administration needs to establish a foundation upon which their successors can continue the war against the deep state in the hope that one day America can be cleansed.
I mean, why does it never get discussed in Britain to any real extent that, in fact, far from having Russia as an enemy today, it would make far better sense for us to actually have Russia as a friend? I mean, the one person I know who is quite prominent in British politics, who does talk about this sometimes, is Dominic Cummings, by the way, though obviously he talks about this less. But specifically, I mean, we, as you rightly say, are a country that is based on finance and services and that sort of thing. They are huge in natural resources, in industry. You talked about the scale of the industrial system that exists there. And surely we are complementary economies. I mean, whatever we were in the 19th century, we are very different today. So would it not make much better sense for us, rather than looking all the time to pitch quarrels with them, to actually try and find ways forward together with them in a way that would actually work to our benefit? I'll just give one example. When the Russian companies were doing big IPAs in London, which they were, that actually was very, very useful and good for the British stock market. Ever since that stopped, it's been sagging, it's been going downhill. And you can find that right across the entire financial services industry, that the loss of the business with Russia has been a significant blow.
The British ruling elite, or the British establishment, or indeed the British deep state, does not wish to share power in the world with Russia. Firstly, there is the historic mistrust, suspicion, and loathing of Russia at the heart of the British establishment. That is not going to change. Secondly, and this is now a new or a relatively new development, as I said moments ago, Britain and the rest of the Western world is being attacked. The cultural and spiritual values of the ancient Western nations is under siege. There are malevolent forces in the Western world which are seeking to erode our cultural and spiritual values. So the British establishment also looks at Russia not just as a historic adversary, but as someone, as a country who defends religion, who defends culture, who defends traditional family values. And of course, woke ideology, which is one of the weapons of the Western ruling elites or the globalists, they wish to spread this foul ideology to the whole world. The only country that can truly stand in the way of that and can actually roll it back is Russia, because Russia is a superpower. So therein lies a reason as to why the British establishment do not wish to take advantage of, as you rightly said, Alex, the rich economic potential which exists between the two sides. It's because for the British establishment, they do not wish to feed the Russian economy with more money because Russia stands in its way. But as I said earlier, both sides are still trading with each other. And this is quite remarkable. They still have diplomatic relations with each other, and yet they're fighting a proxy war with each other. They're still trading a war with each other. But as I have previously said, and I can only reiterate, the first year of the Crimean War, Britain and Russia, they're fighting against each other. British soldiers and Russian soldiers are fighting and killing each other in the Crimea. And both countries have embassies in each other's capitals. Politics is a strange business, and in my opinion, it is the most peculiar of all businesses.
What happens when the war ends? Because I completely agree with you, by the way. It can only end in one way, and I think that's now becoming widely accepted. There's still few people who deny it, but it's the trends are not just obvious, but they're becoming difficult to deny. And that is that, we're going to have a Russian victory, and Russia is going to emerge as the victor in a conflict which we were very unwise, in my opinion, to allow ourselves to ever get drawn into. What are we going to do then? The Russians are going to be the great power in Europe once more, the great military power in Europe. Do we continue with the policy of hostility? What can we do? We're getting worried about the Americans leaving. The whole strategic defense review that I was talking about was talking about this. I mean, it's implicit in every sentence and every paragraph that there's the concern that the United States cannot maintain the commitment that it did. Do we continue in our hostility to a country far more powerful than our own? Or do we at least try to do what you said those diplomats of the past and hopefully the present were doing, which is trying to find a way forward?
When the Soviet Union in 1940 incorporated the Baltic states into the USSR, the British government never recognized the Baltic states as being part of the Soviet Union. Then in 1944, when the Red Army recaptured the Baltic states, the British government never recognized the Baltic states as part of the Soviet Union. And from 1944 to the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, the British government, along with the American government, I should add, never recognized the Baltic states as part of the Soviet Union. But there was still, during the aforementioned periods, there was still diplomatic relations between Britain and Russia. There was still trade between Britain and Russia. There were still cultural exchanges between Britain and Russia, or the Soviet Union, to be more precise. That is what I believe will happen when the war in Ukraine ends. And I believe that at the very most, the Russian army will advance to and capture the oblasts of Zhytomyr and Vinnytsia, which, if you're looking at a map of Ukraine, are to the west of Kiev. Thereafter, I'm not so sure the Russian army will advance into those regions, because that region, or that region largely, is historically known as Eastern Galicia. So when we talk about today Ukrainian nationalists, we really are talking about Eastern Galicians, because there's no such thing as a Ukrainian race. We are talking about Eastern Galicians. So once the war ends, yes, of course, there will be a great deal of hostile rhetoric emanating from London at an official level and from other capitals in the Western world. But what are they going to do? They're not going to go to war with Russia over Ukraine for the reasons I mentioned earlier. There would be a nuclear war. The British establishment is very skillful in adapting to new circumstances. Indeed, the British ruling elites have been in power for nearly 1,000 years, since 1066. There's a reason for that. And after most of Ukraine is captured, perhaps even all of Ukraine, but I think most of Ukraine is captured, the reality will be that that the lands of the Russian Federation have enlarged, and that will be it. Because the British the British establishment do not seek to continue this hostile rhetoric indefinitely. At some point, it will start to die off. And again, there have been many times in the past, over centuries, when the hostile rhetoric emanating out of London was enormous, and it is enormous today. But hundreds of years ago, it started to die off. And that will happen after the war in Ukraine ends. And I have no doubt at some point in, say, 50 years' time, it will increase again, and then it will die off. I can only reiterate my submission. Britain and Russia have never liked each other and never will like each other. The most important thing is that diplomatic relations are preserved between both countries, that they continue to talk to each other, either at an official level or at a more secretive level. That is all I care about. The fact that they're not going to be the best of friends or the best of allies, it doesn't disappoint me. It doesn't frustrate me. That's reality. That's realpolitik. But all I want is for them to keep on talking, and especially those channels of communication which have existed ever since the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Indeed, if you want to get an example just of the past, of how things change in Britain, just listen to newsreels about Russia from the 1940s, British ones, and then compare them, for example, the British newsreel made during the time of Alexei Kosygin, that was the Soviet premier at the time, his visit to London in 1967, when to all impressions, you might think that Britain and Russia at that time were the best of friends. Of course they weren't, but that was certainly the impression that that was conveyed. And of course he met the Queen and he had tea with her, and he was taken around, and he met people in all kinds of factories, and everything looked very, very friendly, except of course that it didn't last for very long. Dr. Marcus
Papadopoulos was taken to meet the Queen.
Yes, absolutely. Bolshevik was taken to meet the Queen. Absolutely. So, Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, thank you very much. He was, by the way, because Kosygin was an actual Bolshevik. He joined, I think, in the 1920s. So he was a very, very old guy. But anyway, Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, thank you for answering my question so fully. As you said, British-Russian relations are a fascinating, very, very complicated subject, and a very important one. Thank you for answering my questions. If you could stay there for just a short time, I'm sure that Alex has some questions to put to you.
Yes, we do. We have quite a lot of questions for Dr. Papadopoulos. Let's start with Mark Hewitt, who says, Dr. Papadopoulos, was the 1991 coup attempt in Russia orchestrated to bring Yeltsin to power?
If we're talking about the failed KGB coup in August of 1991 against Gorbachev, well, no. The KGB and the upper echelons of the Soviet military saw the writing on the wall. They saw that with Gorbachev in power, and with Gorbachev not taking decisive action against Yeltsin, that would result in the death of the Soviet Union. The Soviet military and the KGB had already lost control of Eastern Europe. Therefore, they did not want to see the Soviet Union die. So by the KGB attempting to overthrow Gorbachev was a way of removing a hopelessly inept, weak leader from power, which would have meant that Yeltsin would have fallen. In March of 1991, Gorbachev held a referendum in the Soviet Union, And with the exception of the Baltic states, Armenia, Georgia, and Moldova, all of the other Soviet republics voted in this referendum. And the Soviet people were asked, do you wish to preserve the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics? 76% of the Soviet people voted yes, we wish to preserve the Soviet Union. Thus, Gorbachev had a mandate. He should have taken action against Yeltsin. He should have declared martial law. But because he was a weak, useless leader, he didn't do it. So the KGB took things into their own hands in August of 1991, but it was an ill thought out attempted coup, and it was rushed, and it ended in spectacular failure. And it meant that Gorbachev would remain as president, but the power was with Yeltsin. And from that moment onwards, it was obvious that Yeltsin would use his power along with Kravchuk in the Ukrainian SSR and Shushkevich in the Belarusian SSR to kill the Soviet Union.
Matthew asks, is a large European conflict in the future likely?
No, I do not believe that, because of the existence of nuclear weapons. Whilst nuclear weapons are, let's be clear, evil, they do keep the peace. And I would rather see a world which has nuclear weapons as opposed to a world, in particular Europe, which is fighting against each other. There have been so many civil wars in Europe that we do not wish to see another one. So with the existence of nuclear weapons, there will not be a war between Russia and Britain, or Russia and France, or Russia and Germany, regardless of what Russian officials and British officials and German officials, etc., say in public. Behind the scenes, they are saying something very different to each other.
Raphael says, Peter the Great moved and lived in England for a moment.
Yes, indeed. We should also remember that Europe's royal families are ultimately one royal family. So one of the reasons why for the first year of the Crimean War, diplomatic relations were still in existence between the British Empire and the Russian Empire is because the British royal family and the Russian royal family were the same family. So both sides wanted to try and sort out between themselves quickly this little dispute, which is how they saw it. But because of the amount of jingoism in Britain at that time, the amount of Russophobia, for example, in beer halls in London, Russophobic songs were being sung by men and women in those beer halls. It meant that that Britain would have to take steps to end the diplomatic relationship with Russia, and also vice versa, because there was a lot of anti-British sentiment at that time in the Russian Empire. So we should always bear that in mind if we're talking about Peter the Great, if we're talking about Catherine the Great, if we're talking about Nicholas II. They were all related one way or another to the British royal family.
Solaris asks, is Russophobia because of orthodoxy?
No, it is because of two reasons. Firstly, the perception in Britain that Russia, be it Tsarist, be it communist, be it modern day Russia, is comprised of savages, is a land of barbarians. And that is built upon two notions. Firstly, that Slavs, which is what Russians are overwhelmingly, that Slavs are not just inherently disorganized and inefficient, but they are inherently brutal. They are inherently barbaric. The other notion is the sense of Anglo-Saxon superiority. Now, again, there's nothing wrong with being Anglo-Saxon, but the heart of the British establishment believes that because they are Anglo-Saxon, though we can make another argument to counter that, but anyway, officially they are Anglo-Saxon, it means that the Russians, for example, are simply pygmies. And indeed, in the files I used in Whitehall in Stalin's Russia, numerous British officials in the 18th century, the 19th century, 20th century referred to Russians as pygmies in comparison to Anglo-Saxons. Indeed, British officials even remarked that the look of the Russian alphabet, the sound of Russian letters is barbaric. They even remarked during lunches at the Soviet embassy during the Second World War that Russian officials couldn't eat bread properly. And they said it's because they're primitive people. So again, it's because of this perception that Russia is a historic adversary, and because of this perception that Russians are uncouth, indeed barbaric, and thirdly, because of this sense that Anglo-Saxon superiority, and therefore the Russians are simply peasants in comparison to Anglo-Saxon superiority.
Elza says, Lavrov yesterday about the involvement of agencies, quote, I wanted to say the Anglo-Saxons, but now I'll have to do without the Saxons, just without the support of the British.
Well, again, this is another subject matter. Is the heart of the British ruling elite truly Anglo-Saxon? Well, I think their bloodlines are somewhat different. But whilst I understand why Russian officials and other officials in the world talk about the Anglo-Saxon ruling elite or the Anglo-Saxon establishment, I would rather use British establishment because I think it has certain advantages. But nonetheless, yes, Lavrov has referred to the Anglo-Saxon powers, to the Anglo-Saxon world. But then look in Britain today, you know, mainstream media is, I can't say claiming, because if you claim, it means you have evidence. So mainstream media in Britain is saying that there's no such thing as an Anglo-Saxon race. And to argue otherwise is, quote, racist. So these are remarkable times we are seeing in Britain, as well as very dangerous times.
Ralph Steiner asks, was World War I caused by Britain losing economically?
There were numerous factors behind the outbreak of the Great War. One of them, of course, was the rivalry between the European powers. Another was the emergence of the German Empire from 1871 onwards on the back of the Franco-Prussian War was not tolerated by the French, the British, or the Russians. They did not wish to see a new empire emerge because they were very suspicious of the Germans and fearful because they knew that the Germans were a very strong people and a very organized, a very disciplined, a very efficient people. So when the Kaiser spoke about, Kaiser Wilhelm spoke about Germany having a place in the sun, the British, the French, and the Russians were immediately alarmed, and they wanted to clamp down on that, which resulted in the Germans becoming very angry and, as a result, antagonistic. And they decided, well, if Britain can have an empire, if Russia can have an empire, France can have an empire, why shouldn't Germany have an empire? And then you have the arms race, the naval arms race, the dreadnoughts, for example, between Britain and Germany. Then you have the different treaties being signed between the various European powers. It was inevitable that there would be a war, a major war between themselves. And what we saw happen in Sarajevo in 1914 was simply the spark. If the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire hadn't been assassinated, there would have been another event in Europe which would have proved to be the spark of the Great War.
Iranian Kiddo says, Orthodoxy in Russia started by Kievan Rus ruler Vladimir's conversion in 988. He was baptized on the same day he was married to Byzantine princess Anna Porphyroyenity in Chersonissos, now Sevastopol, a Byzantine territory.
Indeed, and that is why the first Russian state in history was Kievan Rus. Kiev is the mother of all Russian cities. That is not Russian propaganda. That is not being a Putin apologist. These are historical, irrefutable facts. I have said before on television for nearly 20 years now, if you go to the National Archives in Kew in London, and up until the end of the 19th century, so before the end of the 19th century, you will not find a British diplomat or a British military official talking about the existence of a Ukrainian people or a Ukrainian race. Why is that? Because there is no such thing. The Ukrainian national identity came about as a result of the East Galicians and also the Austrians. The Austrians, obviously bitter rivals of the Russian Empire, helped to devise the concept of a Ukrainian national identity as a way of trying to undermine the Russian Empire from within. But again, you will not find a British official in the 17th century, in the 18th century, in most of the 19th, all of the 19th century, referring to Kiev as a Ukrainian city, as the capital of a Ukrainian nation. No. So that is why Kievan Rus is the first Russian city in history, and Kiev is the mother of all Russian cities. If someone wants to argue against that, I say to them, go to the National Archives in Kew and find me a document from, say, the 18th century. Prove me wrong. And if you prove me wrong, I'll eat my hat and I will acknowledge I'm wrong. But you won't, because for some 25 years, I've been researching at the National Archives, and you will not find anything. Indeed, only recently, a few weeks ago, I was at the National Archives and I found a document by a senior British diplomat. This is after the war, when he said that we, the British government, do not acknowledge the existence of a Ukrainian people. He said for us, a Ukrainian people are mostly Russians or Poles.
Sanjeva says, we will preserve you, Russian speech, keep you alive, great Russian word. We will pass you to our sons and heirs, free and clean, and they in turn to theirs. And so forever. This is the last stanza of Courage by Anna Akhmatova, Russian soul likely never understood by the West.
And sadly, as a whole, I don't think the Russian soul, the Russian mindset will be understood, though there have been people in Britain over centuries who really have understood the Russian mindset, who have understood the Russian soul. For example, in the 1930s, the head of the Northern Department, Sir Lawrence Collier, who was pushing for an alliance between Britain and the Soviet Union, he understood the Russian mindset. He understood the Russian soul. He had no love for Bolshevism, for communism, but that's irrelevant. His argument was we should get on with each other, regardless of our political differences. And he also understood the Russian soul and the Russian mindset, because he did not arrive at the Foreign Office with baggage, namely this perception that Russians are barbarians, that Russian culture is inferior, etc., etc. So sadly, as a whole, we will not see this understanding of the Russian soul, the Russian mindset. But I assure you, even today, there are people in Whitehall who do understand Russia and who do wish to see good relations between Britain and Russia. And when the files, the archives are opened up in 20 or 30 years' time, sometimes they are delayed 30 years, we will see those British diplomats who are saying very different things behind the scenes.
From Tom, hey guys, family and other commitments aside, would you rather live in the UK or Russia? I just went to Russia for the first time to see my father-in-law and seems better than in almost every aspect.
Britain is my country. I am of part Anglo-Saxon heritage. I love my country. I love my people. I love my cultural and spiritual values. I was baptized as a baby in the Church of England. I was later baptized in the Greek Orthodox Church. Both mean a lot to me, but I'm very aware that these are very, very dangerous and sinister times in Britain, but I'm not going to walk away from my country, from the land of my forefathers. I will never do that. I will never submit. I will never change my stance. I believe that the British national identity, that the British people must be preserved. Britain is my home, and there will never be another home for me.
Alexander? Answer was
Yes,
the guys.
I have
Dr.
no.
Papadopoulos and
Yes,
yourself.
I have very similar feelings. I mean, I wasn't born in Britain. I was born in Greece, and I obviously have a very powerful connection to Greece. And I can imagine myself one day possibly returning to Greece to retire and end my life there with my family. But I cannot imagine any situation where I would want to live in any other country than Greece or Britain. I mean, these are my homes. These are my homelands. Greece is my fatherland, if you like. Britain is my motherland, whatever. But I can't imagine living anywhere else. I have just been to Russia. I discussed in various programs my impression of St. Petersburg, the fact that it is an absolutely first world city. Somebody like, the kind of work we do, the contrast between internet connectivity there and internet connectivity in London is shocking. If we knew about it in London, I mean, things that take about an hour to upload here take about 90 seconds to upload there, just to say. So it just goes to, going to the point that Marcus was saying, that, they're not savages or inferior to us in any sense. But the point I mean, at the end of the day, I remain Greek, British. These are my homes, and I don't want to go anywhere else.
Ruby Appel says, thanks, guys. The guest is very knowledgeable, and like Alexander, he makes a lot of common sense about the craziness of the British establishment against Russia. Thank you for that, Ruby Appel. And we'll do a couple of more for Dr. Papadopoulos. 1 second. From Flying Boar, if Britain thinks so bad of Russia, why do Russian liberals love them so much?
Well, of course, when we say the word liberal today, we don't mean a classical liberal. I am not a classical liberal, though I acknowledge there are many admirable elements in classical liberalism. But of course, in modern day Russia, Russian liberals, who as I say, they are not true liberals, they wish to see Russia return to how it was during the 1990s under during the tenure of Boris Yeltsin. So many of these Russian liberals care nothing for the cultural and spiritual values of the Russian people. They are more focused on materialism. They are more focused on money making, and they don't care about Russian history. They don't care about the Russian national identity. Indeed, you can apply that to so-called liberals in Britain, or you can actually apply that to so-called liberals in Britain and so-called liberals in America and in Canada and Britain and France and Italy. So we should always be very mindful when we use the word liberal. We should say so-called liberals, or if we're writing the word liberal, we should put it in inverted commas.
Florina says Russia was also barbarian when the British establishment married the second son of Queen Victoria to Tsar Alexander II's daughter.
Yes, that is a very, very good observation. And what we see two levels at play during, let's say, the period of the British Empire and the Russian Empire. We see the profound relationship between the British royal family and the Russian royal family, which, as I said, essentially was one royal family. Then at the next level, at the political level, involving prime ministers and other politicians, we see this distinct hostility being advocated from Whitehall and at Westminster towards Russia. As I said, the relationship between Britain and Russia ever since the 1500s is absolutely fascinating. And on occasions, it's difficult to comprehend. But if you understand that at that time in Europe it was run by one family, the European royal families, the situation starts to become a little more clear. But yes, what your guest just noted, yes, it's on the face of it, it is quite ironic. Why did they marry into a family which are barbarians? But most of the Russian royal family were not Russian. They were, of course, German. For example, Catherine the Great was German. And during her tenure, she is the one who introduced agricultural policies which made Russia excellent in the agricultural sector. Well, how did she do that? She invited Germans from the German states, there was no Germany at the time, from the German states to settle in Russia, in particular along the river Volga, not so far from Volgograd today. And those farmers taught Russian farmers an immense amount of knowledge. So that's something we need to remember, that the British royal family and the Russian royal family were one family, and many of the members of the Russian royal family were not ethnic Russian. And I'm not anti Tsarist Russia. There were incredible achievements during the period of the Tsars, but most of them were not ethnic Russians, especially during the period of the Romanovs.
We'll do a couple of more, Marcus. Is that all right?
Absolutely.
Two more questions. Awesome. From Raphael. What I know is China will be the one fighting England. They want payback for the Opium War. Mao never forgave England for that.
In my opinion, there will not be a war between China and Britain, and there will not be a war between China and America. Again, what is seen on the surface in relations between China and Britain is very different to what's happening behind the scenes. The Chinese economic miracle is largely built upon China's trade and investment relationship with America and also with Britain. Therefore, it is not in the interests of the Chinese or the British for there to be a severance in that economic relationship between the two, because both countries would suffer enormously. And especially that applies to the relationship, the trade and investment relationship between America and China. But of course, in China, the Chinese government is playing to an audience, like the British government is playing to an audience. But note how, despite all these hostile, antagonistic words which have been expressed between the Americans and the Chinese and the British and the Chinese, no steps have been taken to alter the economic relationship between those countries, because they know very well that that would be economic suicide. So there will not be a war between China and Britain, and there will not be a war between China and America. If we look just in the last few years, the economic relationship between London and Beijing has increased. Not that I'm saying the British establishment and the Americans aren't suspicious of the growing power of China. Of course they are. Of course they see China as a rival. But again, politics is a very peculiar business. On the one hand, you can be bitter rivals with another country. Indeed, you can fight a proxy war against that country. And on the other hand, you can trade with that country and you can talk with that country. We see that happening between Britain and Russia. And we see that happening between China and Britain, although there's no proxy war being fought between the two at this time. So again, I recommend to people to be very cautious about what is said in public, even by Putin, even by Lavrov. If Putin really, really wanted to take decisive action against Britain, why doesn't he end the diplomatic relationship between the two? Because he understands politics, high-level politics, and high-level international relations. The average person struggles to understand politics and international relations. The average person cannot comprehend at all high-level politics and high-level international relations. Putin does, of course. The heart of the British establishment does, of course. So that is why, on the one hand, Putin makes very hostile remarks about the British establishment or the Anglo-Saxon world, but at the same time, he's quite content to have diplomatic relations with this hostile Britain, and he's quite content for trade to continue between Russia and this hostile country. That's high-level politics, that's high-level international relations. Indeed, that is realpolitik.
Hitchum asks, I am interested in the dynamic of the EU countries within the EU. When it is clear Russia has become the undisputed victor, can the EU survive that blow? Will it break up into a smaller European Union?
Well, as we know, the European Union is not Europe, and Europe is most certainly not the European Union. The European Union is one of the weapons of what I call the Western ruling elites, or the globalists, or the Western deep states, to control Europe, to change Europe politically, socially, and culturally. So the same people who are still in control in America, the same people who rule Britain, the same people who rule most of Europe, these people are the same people. They are globalists. They are the Western ruling elite. And it is only inevitable that they will, amongst other reasons, regard Russia as the enemy. And they know very well that Russia is not an enemy to Europe. Russia is an enemy to them, to their power, to their power base, to their depraved ideology, if we can call it an ideology, to their depraved mindset. So the European Union is in an enormous amount of trouble. I'm delighted to see patriotic and nationalist parties and movements springing up all across Europe, because the ancient nations of Europe, they went to sleep, in a manner of speaking. They did not protect their cultural and spiritual values. Now we see what is happening. Now we see the consequences of not defending your national identities, not defending your people. So people are waking up all across Europe, including in Britain. That is a direct threat to the European Union, and ultimately it's a direct threat to the Western ruling elites. The European Union is not a distinct entity. It is not acting on its own accord, like NATO is not acting on its own accord. NATO and the European Union are major weapons of the Western ruling elites. The Secretary General of NATO, he's a mouthpiece of the Western ruling elites. He's a puppet, a useful idiot. He has a script which is prepared for him by senior people at the heart of the Western ruling elite, and he reads it out. So there's no attachment, no significance should be paid to any Secretary General of NATO, because they're just voice boxes. Sorry, mouthpieces.
Mouthpieces. Dr. Question from locals. The British will not only continue their venomous rhetoric while Russia is in Ukraine, they will fund the Eastern Galician Banderites to attack Russia, as they have done since World War II. Khrushchev was unable, after nearly 10 years of fighting, to fully neutralize the Banderites, and look what happened and where we are today. The Banderites, with their large population of Ukrainians in Russia, are quite capable of continuing terrorism with Ukraine and Russia. That's from Du Abscondis from Locals.
A very pertinent observation. From 1944 to 1945, in spite of the Grand Alliance, in spite of the Anglo-Soviet Treaty of May of 1942, even though the war with Nazi Germany is still ongoing, the British establishment and the Americans were helping nationalist forces in the Baltic states and nationalist forces in the westernmost part of Ukraine, Eastern Galicia. That is remarkable. That is something in Whitehall in Stalin's Russia, my second book, I make note of. And British diplomats were absolutely horrified upon learning that. And they said that the British military will bring about the end of the Grand Alliance. They will bring about the end of the Anglo-Soviet treaty, and they could bring about a war after the war with Nazi Germany is over. They could bring about a war between Britain and Russia. So if we talk about the present day, if the Russian army advances into eastern Galicia, then undoubtedly the assistance to the eastern Galicians will continue. But will the Russian army advance there? One of the mistakes that Stalin made in taking, in 1939, regions such as Lvov was this. On the one hand, yes, it added depth to Soviet defenses, yes. But on the other hand, Stalin brought a population into the Soviet Union which wasn't just vehemently anti-Bolshevik, it was vehemently anti-Russian, Tsarist Russian, or Bolshevik Russian. And that was a problem throughout the duration of the Soviet Union, from the end of the Second World War to the end. So does the Kremlin want the populations of Lvov, Ivano-Frankivsk, Ternopil, Rivne, and Volyn back in the Soviet Union? I suspect not. I suspect the Russian army will advance to and capture Vinnytsia and Zhytomyr and will call it a day. And that would ensure that the southern frontier of Russia would be firmly secure. Russia would be in complete and utter control of the Black Sea. But I could be wrong. Maybe the Russian army will advance into places like Lvov. But if they do, then there will be resistance amongst the East Galician fighters there. And of course, they will be receiving assistance. But here's the irony. They will be receiving assistance via Poland. And the Poles and the Eastern Galicians loathe one another. Let us not forget, during the Second World War, Eastern Galician forces, fighters, massacred over 80,000 ethnic Poles in Volyn. Poles know that. But of course, the Polish ruling elite is beholden to the Western ruling elite. So Poland isn't so independent and sovereign as Polish political nationalist forces like to say. So there is the irony. If the Russian army enters Lvov, then East Galician forces, whose ancestors massacred over 80,000 ethnic Poles in Volyn during the Second World War, will be receiving arms from Poland. Again, politics is the most peculiar of businesses.
And on that note, Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, thank you so much for joining us on the Duran. I have Dr. Papadopoulos' links, as well as his X account link, as well as his book links in the description box down below, and I will add them as a pinned comment when the live stream is over. Thank you, Dr. Papadopoulos.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Absolute pleasure. I thoroughly enjoyed it.